Hello. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Mazie Harris. I'm one of the curators in the Department of Photographs at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. I want to begin by offering gratitude and respect to the Gabrielina Tongva peoples, the longtime stewards of this region. I think it's all the more powerful to think about land acknowledgements as we do these Zoom conversations, because I think wherever you are, um, it's important to think about our debts to our ancestors and their care and determination. With gratitude also to María Magdalena Campos-Pons, the artist whose exhibition is on view at the Getty until May 4th. She entrusted the Getty with her work, and we're so grateful to get to share it with all of you that are in the Los Angeles region. The exhibition was co-curated with Carmen Hermo, who is now a curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. But all exhibitions are really intense collaborative projects. And so I want to thank not only the sponsors who financially supported the project, Rob Lovelace and Alicia Mignana, but all of the colleagues who worked for many, many years to bring this exhibition to fruition. Colleagues at the Getty Museum and at the other exhibition venues, the Brooklyn Museum, Nasher at Duke, and the Frisk Museum in Nashville. If you have had the chance to see the exhibition, you'll have seen a gallery devoted to the artist's work in collaboration. It's really key to Campos-Pons. And so I'm honored today to be joined by two of her longtime collaborators, LaTasha N, Nevada Diggs, and Del Marie Hamilton, both of whom have worked with Magda for decades. I can't think of anything more pressing right now than the importance of gathering ideas and people together. It's really through conversation, through collaboration, that we can think about the things that can help nurture and sustain us in these difficult times, and also bring attention to injustice in its many forms. So I'm grateful to LaTasha and Del for their willingness to speak with us today about some of what they've learned about collaboration in the many decades that they have been practicing artists and collaborating with María Magdalena Campos-Pons. They have incredible bios, and I encourage you to spend time with both of those, and we'll add those to the chat. So I'll just give them briefest of introductions for each of them. LaTasha in Nevada Diggs is a poet and writer, a vocalist, a performance, a sound artist, and she teaches at Brooklyn College. She joins us today from New York. Del Marie Hamilton is a curator as well as an artist, and she's currently the acting director of the Cooper Gallery at Harvard's Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. She joins us today from Boston. I invite both of them to turn their cameras on. Del and LaTasha will speak to all of us about their work. I'll get the chance to ask some questions, and then we'll invite you all to ask questions as well. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. Because we're together in this virtual space, we thought we'd start with a moment of connectivity, and LaTasha is going to lead us in that. LaTasha?
Hello, everyone. Thank you again to Mazie and everyone at the Getty for inviting Dell and I to be part of this conversation, both celebrating Magda's work and also to discuss collaboration. 2025 has been a trip. We thought 2024 was a trip. We thought 23 was a trip. We thought 22, 21, 20. And here we are. So I've been watching Shaka Khan's little meditation videos celebrating the winter solstice, the summer solstice, the eclipse, the solar, the lunar, and channeling just a little bit of her. I'm going to ask us to quiet our minds for a minute. For those who were out there on the streets yesterday, I honor you and I respect you, and I'm so grateful You were able to do it. I ask you now to quiet your minds just for a little moment. And we're going to do some breathing, but we're also going to do some affirmations. The affirmations are coming from the 42 ideas of Maat, which is Egyptian. And I'm going to just read a couple of them. And as I ring the bell and let the bell sing, I would like you to repeat after me some of these virtues. So let's get going. I'm also working with one hand because I can't hold the bowl in the other. So we begin. Close your eyes now. I am peaceful. I live in truth. I speak with sincerity. I relate in peace. I care for the earth. I am trustful in my relationships. I spread joy. I do the best I can. I create harmony. I invoke laughter. Now, everybody just laugh real big. I invoke laughter. Yay! I am kind. I am open to love in various forms. I am kind. I am forgiving. I remain in balance with my emotions. I affirm that all life is sacred. I affirm that all life is sacred. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those affirmations, those words that I think really help us think and visualize potential. Um, so here we are, gathered together with these words to help sustain us through this program and through the weeks and months and years to come. Um, So it's wonderful to think forward in that way. And we're going to take a few moments to look back. Dell is going to tell us a little bit about some of her recent work, and then we'll hear LaTasha speak about her work as well. And then get to ask a few questions, but be thinking of your own questions as we're listening to each of them share their projects. Let me start with our slides.
Great.
Bill, thank you so much for being here. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the images that you've selected to share with us today?
Will do. In the spirit of this talk on collaboration, I wanted to talk about two projects. One project's from 2021, and then the second one is still in process. So first one I'll talk about is this installation that you're seeing on the screen. It's called The End of Susan, The End of Everything. And I produced it for the ICA Boston's Foster Prize exhibition back in 2021. And it was during the height of the COVID pandemic. Next slide. When I first met curator Jeffrey DeBlois during a studio visit in 2019, I remember that we talked about what I was working on in the studio at that time, but mostly I remember us talking a lot about the books we wanted to read. And that alone made me feel at ease and that this was a curator that I had an immediate connection with. Next slide. And then towards the end of our conversation and studio visit, Jeff asked me what my dream project would be. And I immediately blurted out that my friend Susan Abigail Denker passed away in 2016. When I met Susan in grad school, I was in the middle of my, I think, second or third year at grad school, but she had already retired from teaching 2+ decades at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which is also where Magda Campos-Pons used to teach. Susan was known as being very eccentric, very ornery, very passionate, but an really incredible and generous teacher and scholar. Even though we were from different cultural and racial backgrounds, the things that really held us together was our love of African-American cultural production in all of its genres. So when Susan passed away in 2016, I was greatly surprised to learn, though, that I was named as a beneficiary in her will. My inheritance was both mundane and extraordinary. I inherited her 2005 Toyota RAV4, her color art slides, her syllabi, her art books, her takeout menus, her reading glasses, makeup and maps, her vibrator, her medications, her china, furniture, outdated medical equipment, outdated office equipment, blaxploitation films, mailing supplies. I also inherited the personal belongings of her husband, Jerry Sobel, and that included his baby pictures, his philosophy books, his diplomas, his dissertation, as well as crates and crates and crates of classical music CDs. So when Jeff asked me about what my dream project would be, I wondered what would happen if I could make an installation of this inheritance. I had no idea at the time what that would look like, since for many years, all these items just sat in storage units because I couldn't grapple with my grief. However, Jeff challenged me to let go of my fears and see where the process might take me. As I dug into Susan's things, I found some treasures. They include a first edition copy of Winter Trees by poet Sylvia Plath, a first edition Octavia Butler novel, her first novel, Wild Seed. And then I also found signed literary works by major figures of the Harlem Renaissance that included Countee Cullen and Arna Bontemps. In my discussions with Jeff, we also looked at the work of artists and curators who also interrogate archives and personal collections. And that included the work of Renee Green, her import-export funk office piece, Kari Upson's Larry Project, Don Vo's IMUUR2, and Harold Zayman's installation, Grandfather, a Pioneer Among Us. Next slide. I'm thinking through Susan's apartment and how she lived in that space. I decided that my installation would be broken up into 3 sections: the living room, study, and the bedroom. Taking a cue from the cubby-style bookcase that was in her apartment, the angular lines of the bookcase resembled her crown moldings, and the grid-like design spoke to Susan's many, many years of teaching painting. To give you a sense of scale, that bookcase in the living room stood over 17 feet tall, and it was, 7 feet tall and 17 feet wide. In that bottom third image, I'll note the 3 slide projectors. They were proxies for the 3 bedroom windows that she had in her apartment. I selected images from her art slides and then I had them rigged to advance the carousel slide every 30 seconds. That was truly ghost in the machine, because every time I would come to see the installation with another colleague or friend, the images were changing the order that I put them in. The image at the top of the clouds is one of the last images in Susan's camera, and then the image below that is one of my photographs. Next slide. I also wanted to respond to Susan's books and her personal items by wearing her clothing and making video performances. So the first image is a piece called An Elegy for Susan. That's a single channel piece where I make slow and cryptic hand gestures in front of the camera. The second image is Les Dueling Demoiselles. It's a feminist response to the patriarchal gaze of Picasso's 1907 Demoiselles d'Avignon, as well as Robert Colescott's response to that painting, which is called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon Vestidas. That painting was done in 1985. And both of those paintings were really important paintings and part of Susan's teaching materials. And that third image you see at the bottom there, that's a piece called Jackson Pollock, Two Figurative Alternatives. And I morphed between being Jackson Pollock and Susan wearing her clothes at a lectern and reading from her 1971 research paper where she explicates Pollock's decision to try to merge figuration and abstraction right before his death. Next slide. The process of responding to Susan's items was also quite multivalent. It brought to the surface a lot of questions around meaning and legibility and how her things could be interwoven with my interests in pop culture and history. So take, for example, the 1967 debut album by the Velvet Underground and Nico. The intact and removable banana sticker on the album was designed by Andy Warhol. And it was truly a really extraordinary find as I was going through Susan's things, not just because of its relationship to pop culture and modern art and the Dadaist kind of movement, but because that banana reminded me of the banana plantations of United Fruit Company, aka Chiquita, whose exploitative history was part of my grad thesis installation. Over the years, I'd been collecting material culture from United Fruit Company. So next to the album, I then placed a recipe book produced in Boston in 1904 by the United Fruit Company. So these recipes are the reason why we eat bananas with our cereal. The materials on the lower shelf include a china place setting that would have been used to serve passengers on United Fruit Company's Great White Fleet. And then the books on the shelves are texts on the history of Honduras, as well as books by Zora Neale Hurston and O. Henry, who both spent significant time in Honduras. Next slide. Shifting now to a public art project that I'm working on with a friend of mine who's also an artist and a filmmaker named Angela Counts. This piece is called Mark, Phyllis, and Phoebe, A Murder Told in 3 Parts. It's still very much in process. We're developing the screenplay right now. It's going to be a 3-channel piece, and it'll launch in Boston in 2026, curated by the Boston Public Art Triennial. This particular installation recounts the 18th century poisoning of Captain John Codman. In 1755, 3 enslaved African Americans basically plot to murder him. Mark and Phyllis are tried and convicted of murdering Codman. Phoebe is sent to be sold off to the West Indies. But the salacious bits of Phyllis and Mark's execution is what people seem to always really focus on. And that's because Mark's body was gibbeted and hung on a large armature for about 20 years. Phyllis was burned at the stake. There's only one other instance of burning at the stake, and that too is another enslaved Black woman, which take place in 1681, and that woman's name was Maria. Back in 2022, when I first came across this story or Mark's execution, I learned about it from a fellow artist. The first thing I did is go to Google, and then this document that's on the left is what popped up. A paper by Abner Cheney Goodell from 1883 called The Trial and Execution for Petty Treason of Mark and Phyllis, Slaves of Captain John Codman. On the right is a broadsheet, and you see the last and dying words of Mark, aged about 30, emblazoned across the top. The text of the broadsheet is said to be a speech from Mark just prior to his execution. In many ways, the way that we encounter enslaved people in the archive is through account books, bills of sales, asset inventories. These documents are really quite unusual in that they include both Mark and Phyllis's voices. The Goodell paper includes crucial aspects of the murder plot, as well as names of accomplices, as well as interrogation records and an analysis of capital murder in the colonies. While Mark's broadsheet tells that he was born in Barbados in 1725 and that a brass maker named Mr. Salter taught him how to read. In 1798, Paul Revere, in a letter to Jeremy Belknap, who's the founder of the Massachusetts Historical Society, is where he recounts encountering Mark's body. After I passed Charlestown Neck and got nearly opposite where Mark was hung in chains, I saw 2 men on horseback under a tree. What's striking about the broadsheet and the paper, the Goodell's paper, is that the stories between what Mark says and what Phyllis says differ quite a bit. And so that then had me thinking a lot about the work of Saidiya Hartman and her theory of critical fabulation. So in that work, she asks us to wrestle with the omissions and the gaps in the archive. Quote, listening for the unsaid, translating misconstrued words, and refashioning disfigured lives. Next slide. So while the history of colonial Black Massachusetts is popularly understood through the martyrdom of Crispus Attucks or the service of the Union Army's all-Black 54th Regiment in the Civil War, our project is going to be a discussion and a sort of look at Massachusetts and what it was like prior to its founding as a democratic republic. But we're also going to be taking our cues from the work of John Acumpha and Isaac Julian. And in that way, our goal is to really think about Mark, Phyllis, and Phoebe's lives and all the events and what might have happened in terms of bringing them to, again, sort of like undertake this desperate plot to poison John Codman. Next slide, which will be the final image. And just to kind of close out, this is from a performance that I did with Magda in 2016, where you can see me there dressed up as Abraham Lincoln. And so this was 2016 at the National Portrait Gallery for a series called Identify, and curated by Dorothy Moss. And so I will end it there, and hopefully there will be lots of great questions about what I talked about.
Yes, thank you. Oh my gosh, so much to think about and build on. Thank you for helping us think about inheritance and that kind of catalyst for reflection. And I think really history is the presence of history. It's not past, but very present. So thank you for that. I think I'm looking forward to circling back to that. LaTasha, you want to tell us a little bit about some of the images that you chose to bring today?
Sure thing. And thank you again, Dell. Your fascinating work. I mean, yeah. And also thinking about artifacts, archives, salvaging materials. For me, particularly with the project In Search of Sugarcane, the breakup, I was invited by DIA to participate in their poetry series. And what I proposed was something a little bit more than a poetry reading. I wanted to do, in very clear language, I wanted to set up a funeral for an apartment. And the apartment was my home for close to 40 years. Because I'm good for babbling, I'm going to read the description. So it's a multimedia project comprising of the publication In Search of Sugarcane and the video, The Breakup, both produced this year as part of a memorial service at DIA Chelsea. The publication, which is a hybrid essay, draws from my book that was published in 2023, Village, documenting the purchase of a 21-unit, 5-story building, post-war building, in central Harlem and its surrounding block and community. The Breakup, which is the film I did in collaboration with Gabri Krista, who is an old-time collaborator and who directed this film, along with Eve Kayan, who did sound design and editing. We talked about doing a non-narrative experimental take on a native Harlemite, who is me, attempting to fight and remain in a rent-stabilized apartment through the sounds of active demolition and water leaks and unwelcomed visitors. So the performative installation in itself featured the film, also an altar which I constructed that was in honor of the apartment, an altar for apartment 5RE, as well as the publication. And I wanted to expand the conversation that we oftentimes hear about, read about, through a third-person narrative, and rather turn it around and make it a first-person narrative about the housing crisis, displacement, and the embodied impact of spatial and communal memory. In short, when is home no longer home? And what are the dilemmas and legacies that perplex the native Harlemite? So this is the altar that you see, of course, with the framed mailbox door. Understanding that with the final apartment, I was the last holdout, with the final apartment now being turned over, knowing and understanding that the legacy of that building, the history of that building, the history of the walls, the doors, the floors, all of that is in the process of extreme erasure. So the stories that I know, and maybe the walls know more than me, are no longer. So who gets to archive that? And can we deem an apartment which we may think of as a non-living thing? Can we consider that an actual entity in itself? Does it breathe? Does it cry? Does it laugh? And so the pictures on the altar are pictures I took at the very end of the closure of every segment of the apartment that I could think of, including the light bulb stick, which was very, very long, that was used by the prior tenants to change the light bulbs because the ceilings were so high, or the dress that I left, or the bookcase that I left, are the light switches that I collected from all over the place. You could change this image. Here you see the ephemeral materials, the book In Search of Sugarcane, which contains the essay, the laminated memorial card, because if you are from a particular community, you look out for those laminated memorial cards at the funeral. They're collected, they're kept, they're made as bookmarkers, they're made as pictures in a wallet, and of course the program, which is going to tell you what's going to happen. And these were important because one, as someone who does not like to be linear, and rather likes to work in layers of pieces, this attaches to the film. This attaches to the altar. Next image. So two images here. So one, you see a colleague in front of mine who's actually an artist as well, Harry Hawks. They are looking at a specimen from the apartment, which I titled The Last Splinter. And it was literally like a 3-inch splinter from the floors, which for whatever reason I kept it. And it turned out to be a great artifact to put in this installation. And so in my kind of warped humor, I wanted that there because that's part of the home. And then this image is towards the end of the event, which turned into a party, a house party. Because with all funerals, you have a moment of mourning and closure, and then it's time to eat and dance. So the image that you saw earlier of the young gentleman holding a big gourd, he was holding a gourd distributing pieces of sugarcane because I felt that the closure needed to be sweet. And so everybody in the audience received sugarcane. Next image. This image is actually a still from an invitation from Ocean Space, which is TBA 21 Academy. They invited me to create a piece that was in conversation with the ocean. Note that this was 2019 and 2020. This could have been really fascinating to see the Venice canals, just the difference between 2019 and 2020. But this was a conversation piece, solo with electronics and vocals, that was dedicated to the ocean, that talked about the ocean, that talked about some of the concerns that the local folk of Venice actually have with tourism, with ships, with the overall state of buildings and architecture, and the fact that it's sinking by increments. So that was in 2019. So we can go to the next image. I don't know if there's any more.
My
I think
computer's
that's it.
okay. My
Yeah.
computer's reacting a little bit slowly to my prompts, so we'll see. The other image
Okay.
should come any minute now. Let's see if I can encourage some action here. Well, thank you both as we're waiting for the computer to keep up with us as we move through the slides. Thank you both. It's just wonderful to kind of get to consider the resonance between these different projects that you've helped us to think about and the ways that histories and things are, have such palpable force in our lives. So thank you for that. Um, this is my chance to get to ask some questions. I have some slides that are not loading right now, but hopefully we'll get some slides going. And I can ask some questions, but I'm asking everyone in the audience to be thinking about your questions as well. We already have one question, so keep them coming, and we'll get to those in just a minute. I thought I'd begin by asking the slides that I have are slides that are not loading, are slides of your performances, your collaborations with María Magdalena Campos-Pons, and I think each of you have spoken about collaborative aspects of your own practice as well. As someone who's not a practicing artist, and I assume that's true of some of the people joining us in this Zoom as well, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how working collaboratively as artists has helped you think about collaboration in your sort of daily life. Are there things that you've learned from your artwork that you've been able to bring to your life outside of your artwork?
I would say for me, definitely. So I think partly because in grad school, I was diagnosed with ADHD. And once I sort of always knew I was different, but I didn't know in what ways I was different. But I remember first kind of just talking to my therapist about, how do how do you share this information with people? And then how do I sort of think about my life going forward? And collaboration, I can't remember, I don't know that that's the exact word that my therapist used at the time, but she indicated, simply, Del, what happens if you just ask for help as opposed to just trying to mask and pretend that you are someone that you aren't? What happens if you just come to it openly and just say and just let people know that you need help? How would that change things? And so what I've learned, since graduating school over a decade ago is that I don't think there's an area of my practice that operates without another human being involved. And in some cases, as you can see, ghosts. So the way that I think about my practice is that it's always a moving target, and that's okay. For my projects to be intuitive or idea based, or oftentimes too, just out of a desire to work with a close friend, like my friend Angela and I working on this 3-channel installation piece. Neither one of us have done public art, but we think very similarly in the way that we approach things in the studio. So when I got this, commission from the Boston Public Art Triennial to do a public art piece, they asked me initially about doing a performance piece, but I had broken my ankle at the time. So then that forced me to, again, sort of rethink how was I going to go about my practice and what might I do in terms of this invitation. And, the more I thought about it, I thought, you know what, this is a great opportunity for me to reach out with a dear friend and colleague, and to think through how do we develop a public art piece in a multi-channel format. So I would say so many of my ideas sort of start as like a kernel in my brain, but it's talking with friends and colleagues that always helps kind of enlarge the conversation so that it's not just about me.
Thank you for that, and thank you for to AV for getting the slides up. I'll take a brief interlude here to talk us through some of these images. Give LaTasha some time to think about that big question that I asked. This is a performance for the exhibition María Magdalena Campos-Pons Behold that is currently on view at the Getty Museum. When the exhibition opened in Brooklyn, the artist started a performance series there. This project that she's been calling A Mother's River of Tears, and you see Magda there in the center, with LaTasha on the right-hand side and Dell kind of hidden in the back there on the left. So this is the sort of most recent example of them working together. And this is a performance that the last iteration of which Magda did for us at the Getty a few weekends ago. So hopefully some of you were able to join us for that. And the next slide, please. We'll see an image of a performance that Magda did at the National Gallery, and that's related to a film that both Dell and LaTasha participated in. That film is on view in the Getty exhibition. And so again, there's this relationship between, as we've heard already, of sort of live performance and filmic experience. And maybe if we have a chance, we can think a little bit about the differences of those types of interactions with audience. And the next slide. And I think you'll see some visual connections that are running through these things, and I think that have some connections with some of the images that LaTasha showed as well. So this is a slide, excuse me, some still images from the When We Gather video, and thank you to the team for adding the link for that video in the chat so that you can watch this video. It's just incredibly powerful piece, and it's really a piece that's about looking to the history of women who fought for change, and so certainly I think continues to be resonant and relevant. Next slide. And here we have the first project that these three incredible humans joined together to work on. This is a performance actually initiated by another extraordinary human, Carrie Mae Weems, who had a retrospective at the, a survey exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum in 2014. The first exhibition there, survey exhibition focused on an African-American woman, and she invited Magda to perform to sort of cleanse the space, and Magda in turn invited Dell and LaTasha to participate in that. So we've been looking at a lot of both of you draw from archives in your work, and so here we're looking at some sort of archival pictures, but both had known Magda for years before they did this performance, and then kind of came together in this way. So if we have time, we'll get into some more questions about the specifics of that, because it's really a delightful story. But I think you draw out such a great point, and we can finish with the slides now to AV. Thank you. You can thank you so much for bringing those in when my computer wasn't working. Thank you, Dell, for just that basic reminder. Such a great life lesson. Ask for help. I've been trying to teach my toddler that lately, and it's just such a valuable thing to think about. And how about for you, LaTasha? How are some of these kind of processes of collaboration inform your life, or vice versa?
Well, a couple of things popped up in my head while Dell was speaking. One, to piggyback on the item of asking for help. I too have that problem. I don't want to ask for help. I think it may be a generational thing where you think that as a creative, you need to be skilled in everything and everything, and that you can manifest these materials with ease. And I'm coming into some acceptance of within myself that, like, I can't do everything. I need to ask. There's also a part of fearing no, right? That like if you ask for help, someone may say, no, I can't help you. Or right. Someone will take your ask, your request for help as something bigger and larger. Now, of course, this is something that within my brain that's my brain telling me, you know, or this is some, or stemming off of some previous um, experience where you're attempting to work with someone that you appreciate and honor a lot, and they may misunderstand your request. So you're shell shocked. So you don't want to ask anybody else. You're like, I got this. In the case of this recent project that I did at DIA, it had to, a lot had to do with me saying, yes, I would like help with this. And also recognizing that someone like Gabri Christo, who I worked with for many, many years, collaborating on her projects, it was now finally time for me to say, Gabri, come come and work on this one for me. And I mean, and this was of course not without conversation, a conversation that was basically started with Gabri, right? And it was like, yeah, of course I would want you to work with me, but I never, for some reason there was the fear, right? The other thing, when you talk about collaboration, I think about not so much initially collaborating with artists, but working with artists as a performer, working with artists as the hired work, right? And which I've done many, many, many years of working with this artist, being a body here, being a voice here, being a body here, and you're working on their projects. You don't necessarily have any say in what they do, but you are participating and you are supportive as you can. And what you learn through those experiences, and then also what you learn in terms of how you can even tweak your own approach to things, right? It's like, oh, I am a poet. I don't necessarily have to do the standard stand in front of a mic and a podium and read, right? Um, I don't think that way. And I actually know and have seen other ways of delivering this work. So why not do it this way? And then also thinking about the collaborative work that I've done, not necessarily with fellow artists, but what I did during 2018 and 2022, collaborating with tenants' rights activists to learn my rights, right? And collaborating, and what I mean by collaborating is it's like, okay, if I have to fill out this paperwork, I'm working with an activist, somebody who is actively doing this around the clock, working with people to understand these materials and to gather their materials and everything. So, and so I think a lot about that. But then all of those materials, those forms, those documents, and saying, what if we create these into art pieces, right? So I think with the In Search of Sugarcane, yes, it was a memorial service. Yes, it was closure, but it was also another way of how do I collaborate with the individuals who get on the bus to Albany every month, it, you know, barraging these senators and what have you to make a change. How do I do something that feels more me, that is speaking to exactly what they are addressing every day, every week? And then the other thing is in collaboration is also understanding each other's language, not literal language, right? Not Spanish, French, what have you, but the language of how this artist works and then how you work, right? So I think a lot about Pauline Oliveras, the composer who wrote these amazing text scores, right? And for the improviser, it's not necessarily understanding what exactly Pauline wants is actually stepping out of that kind of literacy and saying, here is how I interpret what Pauline is instructing me to do. Like her anthology of text scores is like a must, is a Bible, I think, for any artist in any medium. And when I think about Pauline's work with the text scores, then I think about Magda, where Magda, like her instructions are often oral, right? Her instructions, you could say are coming from an oral tradition. This is what you do, this is what you do, this is what you do, right? And then, okay, how do we interpret it, right? So I think something that was really interesting in how Magda instructs her performers, who are then in part to a degree collaborating in an action. It's for us to listen to what she says and then manifest it. So that's something I think over time, Dell and I get the swing of it, like to listen to what she says, try to understand what she says, and then translate it so that both of us are communicating. Yep. And Magda steps away and does the other portion of the performance.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's certainly something that we had to think through for the piece we did in Brooklyn when Behold was opening, partly because that space is so cavernous. So you have to kind of think about how all of you as multiple performers are going to operate in this space. And for LaTasha and I, our instruction was to manipulate that blue fabric as though it were ocean waves. Now, the challenge was that for about 2 days prior to 2.5 days prior to the live performance, rehearsing in the space, LaTasha and I did not have the fabric. So we didn't know how heavy it was, how long it was going to be. We didn't know how flexible it was. So we sort of decided that, if
and I think we had two totally different opinions on how the ocean works.
Exactly. So that was another thing. So we were trying to invent, gestures that she and I could do that we could either mirror to one another or sort of signal in some way, or again, sort of translate, like, what does Magda mean by, this being the ocean, right? So that there were lots and lots of thought processes in trying to figure out how could we make it playful. So LaTasha and I are having fun making up all these different gestures, only to learn later on, no, she wants it to be a little bit more somber, partly because of the music. And that was the other piece of it too. We were learning a score and sound, and the sound having specific cues as to when movements are supposed to take place. So that was one sort of challenge in terms of, like, trying to work with an imaginary piece of fabric. So that's one piece of it. The second piece is, again, the scale. That particular room is humongous. So we spent some time in it working at scale, and then the instances where the museum was open, we worked in our hotel room, in a seminar room, on the basement floor that is not at scale. It is like 50 times smaller than what the space in the museum is. But then it's thinking spatially about, like, how do you zoom in and then zoom out? So those questions around translation and trying to, again, sort of make meaning from another artist's work has been eye-opening, I think, for all of us, over time, working with Magda, and also too knowing that she trusts us as well. She gives us, a great deal of instruction, but there's lots of instances too where she will ask us to, do something really, of our own making. So he dressed up as Lincoln, for the National Portrait Gallery. that was like an interlude within this larger performance. And so she told me that she wanted me to be seated underneath Abraham Lincoln's painting. And I thought, okay, and she also wanted the piece to be in reference to the Caribbean. And so it was not quite clear. It was literally just a few kind of buzzwords. She kind of, I think, texted me or maybe gave me like in a brief phone call. And then I started like looking up like what's Lincoln's relationship to the Caribbean. Come to find out, all things lead back to Harvard. Lots and anytime like one idea I'm working on, it's just like I pull the string and then it takes me back to an archive. So I came across a document of obviously, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, but at one period during the Civil War, I came across a document in one of the Harvard archives, something that was available digitally on Hollis. Essentially, it was a speech or a discussion from a meeting that Lincoln had with some of his advisees during the Civil War, essentially hedging his bets, so that if the North did not win the war, what are you going to do with all these enslaved folks? Clearly, they're a problem. What happens if and even if the North wins or doesn't win, the sort of backup project was to let's repatriate them to British Honduras, which is now present day Belize.
Hmm.
My family has roots in Belize and Honduras, which is why United Fruit Company figures in some of my work. But again, like me sort of learning this alternate history and this alternate frame of thinking about Abraham Lincoln. So I essentially merged the Gettysburg Address with this particular speech that he had given, essentially saying that you Black folks are not like us, and so what about this other proposition? So it was sort of like a remix of those two speeches that I ended up doing as President Lincoln. So
Yeah, this is really helpful. I think there's several, I think, really valuable takeaways there. I think, the kind of space between ambition and acceptance. And when you're working collaboratively, your sort of ambitions and then accepting the role and the power and the strength that comes from other people. I think, this responsiveness to the conditions that we're working in and, trying to be kind of aware of how that is going to impact us. I think really, my question I think was going to be about like, how you manage those that you're working with, but I think you've really helped me to turn that around and really think like how can I support the work of others? And so that's a really beautiful inversion of the mindset that I had had. And then, this idea of interpretation, I think both in the kind of gathering of practical resources, I think, interpreting histories or knowledges that you're gaining. So I think I wanted to note that LaTasha's recent project, for example, a lot of the work that she learned about tenants' rights advocacy, she's put those resources in the publication that she's produced. So again, kind of making practical work from this kind of other kind of intellectual artistic projects. Trust, that's hugely valuable. And then I think to connect us with some of the questions we've been getting in the chat, this, just the reference to this cloth that you were grappling with in the performance, maybe just think about the materials as collaborators. I was thinking of collaboration as between people, but
it's with objects as well.
yeah, and this is a question that came to us in the Q&A as well. So I'm going to pivot to that question. Thank you, Christina, for this question. She says, first of all, she thanks you for your beautiful work, and she wants you to speak about fragmentation in each of your work, the framed segments of the apartment, the last splinter, the banana sticker. How do these fragments, these small pieces kind of coexist, and how are they part of she uses the word cooperate. Do they cooperate? So I think, and she asks also about grief, which I think is palpable in these projects that we've heard. So if you could speak, and we've only got a few minutes left. So if you could speak, in a kind of concise way about the collaborating with things, with materials.
Yeah, I will say that, when I was going through all those objects that belong to Susan, as I said, when I came across that Velvet Underground album, again, it was just like eureka, because I didn't know what I was going to do with these objects. They were, as I said, sitting in storage units. But that one sort of like eureka moment of me being able to understand that it has its own meaning, but it also is generative. It's hearkening to something else, right? And then that breadcrumb led me to another breadcrumb. And so once I knew that, I sort of understood like what those objects could do when I paired them all together. That was my roadmap for thinking through each one of those little cubbies. And we had about 5 days to install my work as well as the work of 3 other artists whose work was happening at that same time at the ICA. So this was for me very much a race against time. When those objects showed up in the gallery space in the museum, it looked like a yard sale in there. And the only thing I could do was hold on to the set of relationships that I had thought through with the album and Zora Hurston's letters and the Great White Fleet, etc. As I developed the piece, the one thing I made sure to do with every single object that came out of storage, I did a ton of research. Every single album, every book I read, every exhibition program, and in that process, the objects then too began to confer meaning and to sort of point me in a particular direction. So for me, it is always about the context and the objects, and that's very much how I think about when I'm curating exhibitions. It is communing with objects and thinking about what they do in space. So my curatorial practice is very much my studio practice. They inform one another.
That's so interesting. And I think as you're saying that, I'm thinking about this, the person who submitted the questions specifically mentioned the splinter, LaTasha. And I love that because, there's this massive building and your life, these kind of massive questions, but then bringing it to this splinter, which is, I guess, the way that the world pokes back at us, right? When the splinter is an irritation, it's us, having to take the world into account, the world like literally embedding itself in our body. So how about you? I like this idea from Dell of generative kind of hearkening of objects. How do they operate for you?
Well, I think in the case of In Search of Sugarcane, the breakup, it did not manifest until I had the invitation, honestly. The materials, the last splinter, it was in my freezer to be funny. It was in two little specimen cups. I kept them. I don't know why. Was I going to sue the previous landlord? Was I going to use them? They were there. They were the things like this elder who left you all of this magical material kept, for whatever reason. And upon receiving the invitation to do something at DIA and then my proposing this is what I'm going to do, all of those little artifacts started to speak to me then. The last splinter didn't immediately speak. It spoke in a dream. It was like, I need to be showcased. I knew I wanted a vitrine. I knew I wanted a specimen case, but I didn't know exactly what would be the specimens. Would the specimens be these documents? Would the specimens be like prints of emails between politicians or what have you? All of the paper trail. And it turned out that what wanted to be showcased was the splinter because it was not only literal, but it was also metaphoric for the whole experience. And like you said, how life can like just jab you in the foot and then it being an ordeal to remove, right? But an ordeal that's also telling you something very, very loud and very, very throbbing. And I think if in any case, that's my approach to materials, right? To look at these materials that might be practical, that might be everyday, that might be horrific, but they're materials that are tied to me, tied to the landscape, tied to the memory, right? Knowing that these images that I took at the last moment would become part of this altar. It didn't happen until I got the invitation, in short.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for that. We're out of time, but I want to I thank you for ending with this word invitation, because I think that's such a wonderful thing that we can give to others and that others can give to us. The invitation to listen, that's the beginning of a dialogue, a beginning of a conversation, a beginning of a two-way experience. And so I think that's just a really fantastic note to end on. I want to thank those of you who joined us. And I'd like to end. Rebecca actually asked us a question that we weren't able to get to. Yeah, AV, can you go to that last slide for us? Beautiful, thank you. Rebecca asked a question that we weren't able to get to, but she said, I think a great question. So I want to leave it with our audience as well. She says, is collaboration a form of medium, a kind of a form of material? And I think that the answer would be yes, right? And I love thinking of it that way. So Rebecca, thank you for chiming in with that. I want to.
I want to say it's also a form of grace. It's a form of grace. It's a form of of finding unconditional love, even when it gets tense. Some collaborations simply don't work because maybe the trust is not there. Maybe the faith is not there. Maybe there's another entity involved, that's causing friction. But ultimately, it's about, going back to the beginning, to love, to generosity, to not compromise, but unconditional love and faith that both of you are going to serve each other well.
That's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful sentiment. And it makes perfect, absolute sense.
Oh my gosh, I can't thank you enough for this. Yeah, what a this you've just given me so much to think on and to work with and to carry forward. And I do feel that we live in a time of friction. And so I'm very grateful for these tools, these strategies to help us navigate. So thank you for today, and thank you for your work more generally. I'm just so grateful to through through Magda that I've gotten to learn about the work of so many, and through you, the work of so many others. And so I think let's continue to have these kind of generative experiences with others where we benefit from these interactions and benefit from all the knowledges that they can share. I want to thank also the public programs team, Heather, Philip, Daniela, Greg, Alden. Thank you to everyone who makes these possible. You'll get to join our next public program on April 27th as well. And I want to plug one more time the exhibition María Magdalena Campos-Pons, which closes on May 4th. And I'd like to encourage you to keep up to date with all that Dell and LaTasha have happening. So many exciting opportunities on the horizon for them as well. Thank you everyone for joining us, and just all best. Thank you.
Be well, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Be kind to yourselves.